Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. A super valuable cartoon game, a new superhero game, and the first TurboGrafx-16 release of this series. I'm your host, Jared, and today is May 6th, 1992. If you grew up in the 90s, or really any decade after the 50s, you probably remember at least one Hanna-Barbera cartoon. The Flintstones, the Jetsons, Scooby-Doo, tons of these got video game adaptations. And this now includes Wacky Races, released for the NES, May 1st, 1992. I didn't really personally grow up with Wacky Races, but it was on reruns all the time on the early days of Cartoon Network. And even then, as a kid, I thought to myself, this is kind of dumb.
Better watch out, Dick.
Why?
You're approaching the end of the bridge.
As the name implies, the cartoon was all about crazy characters racing their equally crazy vehicles, finding themselves in silly situations often caused by the villainous Dick Dastardly and his dog, Muttley. The pair got their own spin-off show in 1969 that lasted 17 episodes, so they must have figured, well, the video game should capitalize on their popularity. 23 years later. So with a cartoon that literally has races in the title, you would think it would be adapted into a racing game. Nah, that would make too much sense. Instead, Wacky Races is a completely normal platformer game. Seriously, it's like there was some contract that said licensed games at the time had to be turned into platformers. Oddly, you play as the villainous dog Muttley trying to rescue Dick Dastardly. At the end of each level, there is a boss fight, one for each of the other racers from the cartoon. Evidently, this was a big enough deal that Nintendo Power made it one of their main featured games in their May 1992 issue. They felt it needed a walkthrough for every single level, even though it's a baby game for babies. In the same issue, Nintendo Power reviewed it rather favorably, giving it a 3.3 out of 5. The only other thing notable about Wacky Races is that it was developed and published by Atlus. Yes, that Atlus. In Japan, they were already known for making games like Digital Devil Saga, and later in 1992, they would release the first Shin Megami Tensei game. Meanwhile, in the West, Atlus was more known for developing games like TurboGrafx-16's Dungeon Explorer and the NES titles The Karate Kid and Friday the 13th. They've come a long way since then. Also released this week was the Game Boy game Batman Return of the Joker. Not to be confused with Batman Beyond Return of the Joker. That was released for Game Boy Color, and in the year 2000, totally different games. Also of note, this was more or less a sequel to the Tim Burton Batman movie, as the revered animated series wouldn't debut until September of 1992. Released after the NES version last December, Return of the Joker on the Game Boy was a shrunken down port. It's a bit smaller with only 4 stages instead of 7. It went with a Mega Man style progression. Complete the first 3 stages in any order to unlock an additional final one. More importantly, the shooting elements were removed, so now it's just a straight up platformer. It ends up playing more like Sunsoft's first Batman NES game more than anything. Despite the simplification, it's still reviewed pretty well. Electronic Gaming Monthly praised it for its gameplay, its graphics, and its music. Nintendo Power also rated it fairly well, giving it an average of a 3.6 out of 5. Now that doesn't sound very high, but later in the 1992 Nintendo Power Awards, Batman Return of the Joker topped the categories for graphics, sound, and challenge, alongside heavy hitters like Kirby's Dream Land and Super Mario Land 2. The only category that it didn't even make the top 5 was theme and fun. Reviews used to make no sense at the time. The theme is Batman, therefore it is automatically fun. The only non-Nintendo game also released this week was Ballistics for the TurboGrafx-16. Originally released in 1989 for the Amiga and Atari ST personal computers, the gameplay of Ballistics is simple. Move the ball into the goal by shooting other balls at it. It's a very short game, but it does innovate with plenty of gimmicks and computer opponents. Also, I really dig the guy who places the ball. He looks like a heavy metal mascot, and he intimidatingly says, "Let the game commence." Let the game commence. One interesting change made in the home console version was that you actually control a character. In the PC versions, you controlled a cursor. See, that's what makes the TurboGrafx-16 version so much better, because it's easier for you to tell what's going on. You can tell what's going on, right? Because I'm playing it and I have no idea what's going on. In spite of these unique concepts, Ballistics was not treated too kindly. Electronic Gaming Monthly reviewed it with an average score of a 4.75 out of 10, criticizing its slippery controls and uninteresting gameplay. One reviewer described the guy who places the ball as utterly adolescent, and that was the one who was the nicest about the game. Hey, wait a minute! A game where you try to get the ball into your opponent's goal by shooting other balls at it? This is just a game adaptation of Crossfire!
It's sometime in the future. The ultimate challenge. Crossfire! Crossfire! You get caught up in the crossfire! Crossfire! You get caught up in the crossfire! 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 You'll get caught up in it.
Fun fact, Crossfire originally came out in the 70s. They reinvented it to be rad for us 90s kids. The Ballistics box art is just as metal. Look at how awesome this is. You got this dragon guy flying with some missiles, he's got this steam engine wing thing going on, and this sword. This would make such an awesome metal album cover. Because it is a metal album cover. This is the exact same art that was used for the 1984 reissue of Rock-A-Rolla, the first album by Judas Priest. But before that, it was first used for the sci-fi novel Tsar Nova, originally released in 1981. The artist, Melvin Grant, would go on to make 5 album covers for Iron Maiden, which definitely explains a lot. As for myself personally, I did not have Ballistics growing up, but I did have Crossfire, which was basically the exact same game, but with better controls. This week, I counted 1 NES game, 1 Game Boy game, and 1 TurboGrafx-16 game. Nice and even chart for once. Once again, no huge releases this week. May used to not be a huge month in general. Over in the collector's corner, Wacky Races is the biggest value gainer by far. It released with an MSRP of $49.99, and now just the cartridge of this game will run you over $400. A complete copy with box and manual goes for near $700. That puts it among some of the most inexplicably valuable NES games. A copy of Batman Return of the Joker will run you around $35. Like most other Game Boy titles, the box and manual are increasingly rare, since our parents always threw away Game Boy boxes, with a complete version of it going for $225. Despite being a fairly obscure game, Ballistics hasn't seen much of an increase. You can grab the game card for about $40 and a full box for only $65. Pretty low, relatively speaking. And that's it for today. Next week, we have a never-ending Chinese war, a flight simulator game for the Game Boy, and a Disney movie game, not the one you're thinking of. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. Click the like button, be sure to subscribe if you aren't already, and comment down below if you learned anything from this episode. Not much else to say here, except I did want to leave a little bit of a flex because I own Wacky Races on the NES, and I have the manual. No box though, so if you know anyone who's selling one, hit me up.